I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. Honestly, it still feels surreal even as I try to put it into words. My aunt has always been the cool one in the family. Charismatic, witty, and unapologetically herself. Growing up, she was more like an older sibling than an aunt. So, when she invited me to spend a few days at her house, I didn't think twice. I welcomed the change of pace and the chance to catch up with someone who's always been a bit of an enigma. Her house was just as I imagined. Modern but with a touch of her personality everywhere. Paintings she'd collected from her travels, mismatched cushions that somehow worked, and a kitchen that smelled like fresh herbs and coffee. It felt warm, but there was an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. First, everything was as normal as it could be. We talked about work, family drama, and life in general. She laughed at my stories, her laughter infectious, and I could see why everyone in the family gravitated toward her. But as the hours turned into days, I began to notice little things. Her smile would falter when she thought I wasn't looking. Her phone buzzed constantly, and she either ignored it or answered in a clipped tone, retreating to another room. During dinner one evening, she finally brought it up. "I know it probably seems like everything's perfect here," she started, her voice quieter than usual. "But it's not. It hasn't been for a long time." I didn't know how to respond. What do you say when someone peels back the curtain on their life, revealing cracks you had no idea existed? She talked about her husband, how distant he'd become, how their conversations were now more about logistics than love. It was clear she was carrying a weight I couldn't fully understand, but I listened. That's what she seemed to need more than anything. Later that night, as we sat on the patio with glasses of wine, she said something that caught me off guard. "It's hard, you know, feeling invisible in your own home. Like you're just there taking up space." Her words lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. I told her I understood, even though I couldn't possibly. I thought that would be the end of it, but she looked at me in a way that made me feel unsettled. Not in a bad way, but in a way that hinted there was more she wanted to say. "You've always been someone I could trust," she added, her eyes fixed on me. "Someone who sees me for who I am." I didn't know what to make of it. It was a compliment, sure, but there was something deeper beneath her words. Something unspoken. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking it. But a small voice in the back of my mind told me I wasn't the next day. I tried to shake off the strange feeling from the night before, but it lingered. My aunt seemed more at ease, almost lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. I assumed it was because she had opened up to someone. I told myself that was all it was, a vulnerable moment from someone who needed to be heard. But as the day unfolded, it became clear there was more to it. We spent the morning running errands together. She was in good spirits, laughing and joking as if nothing were wrong. I wanted to believe everything was fine, but there were moments, fleeting but noticeable, where she would look at me differently. Not like family. Not like someone casually enjoying the company of a relative. It was deeper, almost searching. It all started to come into focus later that evening. We were in the living room, her playlist humming softly in the background. She poured us both another glass of wine and settled on the couch across from me. Her eyes lingered and then she said, "You know, I've always admired you. You're different. You have this way of making people feel seen." The compliment caught me off guard, but before I could respond, she leaned forward slightly. "It's rare to find someone who actually listens. You do that so effortlessly." I didn't know what to say, so I mumbled something about how she was probably just overthinking things. She smiled, but it wasn't a typical smile. It was knowing, deliberate. Her tone shifted. "I wasn't sure if I should bring this up, but I feel like I can trust you with anything." She paused, searching for the right words. "You make me feel safe. Like I can just be myself." There was an intimacy in her words that made me uneasy, but I didn't know how to respond without making it awkward. She kept talking, her voice softer now. She spoke about her frustrations, her loneliness, and the way she felt trapped in her life. She wasn't just venting anymore. She was opening a door, one I wasn't sure I wanted to walk through. At some point the conversation shifted. She asked me about my relationships, about whether I felt fulfilled. It felt oddly personal, but I answered as best I could, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But she wasn't letting go. "You're so mature for your age," she said, her gaze steady. "It's refreshing. Most people don't have that kind of depth." There was a pause, heavy and loaded with meaning. I could feel the air change, thick with something unspoken. She reached out, placing her hand lightly on mine. "You're special," she said softly. Froze. Her touch wasn't inappropriate, not overtly, but it lingered just long enough to blur the lines. I pulled my hand back, trying to laugh it off. She smiled again, but there was no mistaking it this time. She was testing boundaries. And I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do. That night I couldn't sleep. The weight of everything that had happened, the words, the looks, the touch, pressed down on me. I kept replaying the moments in my head, trying to convince myself I was overthinking it all. But deep down I knew I wasn't. She wasn't being subtle anymore, and it left me feeling trapped in a situation I never asked for. The next day started awkwardly. We avoided each other for most of the morning. I spent my time scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself, while she moved around the house in a quiet, measured way. It felt like we were both waiting for something to happen. By late afternoon, she finally broke the silence. "I feel like I made you uncomfortable last night," she said, her voice tentative. That wasn't my intention. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to take her words at face value and move on. But before I could respond, she added, I don't feel like myself around anyone else. With you it's different." It was the way she said it. Soft, vulnerable, and laced with something I couldn't ignore. I could feel my pulse quicken as she sat down across from me, her eyes searching mine. "I don't want you to think badly of me," she said. I've been holding so much inside for so long." Her words felt like a plea, but for what exactly I wasn't sure. I tried to steer the conversation in a neutral direction, asking if she'd thought about therapy or talking to someone about her feelings. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You don't get it," she said, almost in a whisper. "It's not that simple." Then she leaned forward, her voice steady but low. "I'm not asking you to solve my problems. I just want you to understand what it's like to feel completely invisible. To want to feel alive again." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I felt my chest tighten, unsure of what to say or do. But before I could respond, she reached out again, this time placing her hand on my knee. The gesture was soft but deliberate, and it sent a jolt through me. "I know this is complicated," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "But you're the only person who's ever made me feel like this." It was too much. I stood up abruptly, creating distance between us. "This isn't right," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "You're my aunt. Whatever this is, it can't happen." For a moment she looked stunned, as if she hadn't expected me to push back. But then her expression softened, and she gave a small, sad smile. "You're right," she said. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have put you in this position." I didn't know whether to believe her. Her words sounded genuine, but there was still something in her eyes, something that told me this wasn't over. I felt a mix of relief and unease as I left the room, unsure of what would come next. The air between us was different after that. The tension hadn't disappeared. If anything, it felt heavier, like an unspoken understanding had settled in. I tried to act normal, keeping conversations light and avoiding any situation where we might be alone for too long. But it was impossible to ignore the shift, the way her gaze lingered or the way she chose her words so carefully now. Later that evening she approached me again. This time her tone was calm, almost resigned. "I think I owe you an explanation," she began, her voice steady but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "About last night. About everything." I didn't say anything, unsure if I even wanted to hear it, but she pressed on. She told me about her marriage, how it had started out with so much promise but had slowly unraveled over the years. She talked about the loneliness, the resentment, and the feeling of being stuck in a life she no longer recognized. "I didn't mean to drag you into this," she said finally. I didn't know how else to feel something again." Her words hit me harder than I expected. There was an honesty in them that made it impossible to be angry, but it didn't make the situation any less complicated. "I'm not saying this to excuse anything," she added. "I just needed you to understand." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. What could I possibly say? That I understood. That I forgave her. Neither felt entirely true. The next morning I packed my things. I told her I needed to leave early, citing some vague excuse about work or obligations back home. She didn't argue. Instead, she simply nodded, her expression unreadable. As I was about to walk out the door, she stopped me. "For what it's worth," she said softly, "I'm sorry. For everything. You didn't deserve to be put in that position." I looked at her, trying to find the right words. In the end, all I could manage was a quiet, "Take care of yourself." The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with everything that had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something that could have changed my life forever, but the guilt lingered. Could I have handled it differently? Had I done enough to set things right? Even now, I can't fully make sense of it all. I haven't seen her since, and part of me is relieved. But another part, a smaller, quieter part, wonders if she's okay, if she ever found a way to fix what was broken in her life. Some things are better left unresolved, I tell myself. Some doors are better left closed. And yet, every so often, I catch myself replaying those moments, wondering what might have happened if things had gone just a little differently.